Today's learning goal is to explain how the flow of energy maintains ecosystem equilibrium. We're going to do this by filling out some energy and equilibria notes. And like usual, we'll go ahead and fill in the notes here on the right side of the paper, and on the left side we'll put our 3 questions, and then at the end we'll have our summary. We've got a couple different ways here we can model the flow of energy in ecosystems. So we've got the qualitative model and the quantitative models. Recall that qualitative means these are observations that you take other than numbers, and quantitative are observations that you record as actual data or numbers. So some qualitative models that we've looked at include food chains and food webs, and some examples of quantitative models are ecological pyramids, or energy level diagrams, for example, the ones that we looked at in chemistry, which were enthalpy level diagrams, or we could also look at energy flow diagrams. So let's take a look at this picture here, and maybe you would be able to figure out, where does the energy in an ecosystem originate? And think about it, could you identify the original source of energy for almost all ecosystems on the planet? So of course, most ecosystems receive energy from the sun, which is then converted into chemical energy during photosynthesis and transferred through the food web. And it starts out as being stored in glucose molecules, and that energy is then transferred to successive trophic levels as it moves through the food web or food chain. Now we say that most ecosystems receive energy from the sun. There are some that do not. There's a very small percentage of autotrophs that live deep down in the ocean, and they actually use energy from the Earth's hot core to make their food. So these are simple bacteria. They live near hydrothermal vents. These bacteria use chemicals like methane or hydrogen sulfide, and they use that energy from the hydrothermal vents to produce sugars with those molecules. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a basic look at photosynthesis and respiration. So of course, photosynthesis is the process by which energy from the sun is used to what we call fix sugars and create high quality energy. This releases oxygen as a byproduct, and then we have the consumers and decomposers which feed on those producers, and by doing so they undergo a process called respiration, where they actually use the oxygen that was produced by the autotrophs to convert the high quality energy from the sugar molecules to do work, and they release some byproducts as well, for example heat, water, and carbon dioxide, which are then of course used as the process continues and repeats itself during photosynthesis. So during photosynthesis, the producers or autotrophs, they use this process to convert light energy to chemical energy. And we can form a basic equation for photosynthesis like this. We've got sunlight plus carbon dioxide from the atmosphere plus water, and it undergoes the process of photosynthesis, and our end products are glucose, which is a sugar, and oxygen. So after photosynthesis in the autotrophs, or the primary producers, we have a process called respiration that undergoes after the primary consumer eats the producer. Now over here we have another diagram of the entire process. We have photosynthesis and cellular respiration together. So in our producers, we have sunlight coming together with carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, as well as some water is needed. We have our plant cell here, which has small structures inside of it called chloroplasts. Basically, in these pancake-like structures, we have a set of chemical reactions that take place that produce glucose. Now, as that's taking place, of course, oxygen is being released to the atmosphere as a byproduct, and then the glucose and oxygen, as it's consumed by the primary consumer, is used within a cellular structure that we call the mitochondria, which then is converted into a molecule that we call ATP, that's adenosine triphosphate. And it's with this molecule that our cells actually use the energy that was stored in the glucose for cellular functions. So as a byproduct of cellular respiration, we have carbon dioxide and water, which then undergoes transformations again during photosynthesis, and the entire process repeats itself. So we should make sure at this point that we would be able to outline the relationship between photosynthesis and respiration. How do they work together? So thus we could summarize and we could say that the chemical energy for respiration comes from the food that consumers eat. The energy is transferred up through the trophic levels in a food chain, and we've talked about this before, but now we're adding in this other element of energy transfer. If we take a look at this simple diagram over here, we can see that a lot of the energy is actually lost as heat as it moves from one trophic level to the next. So just a quick definition here, just to make sure we're all on the same page with the idea of a trophic level. This is the position an organism occupies in the food chain. And as we move up the food chain, you might notice that only about 10% of the energy produced in one trophic level is transferred to the next trophic level. So what happens to the other 90%? Well, the rest of it is lost during metabolic processes, or it just escapes from the carnivore as heat. Sometimes it's used and turned into work. For example, if the animal had to run, this stored chemical energy would be lost as work energy or kinetic energy, and it's lost from the food chain. And here's another example. We've got a pretty simple model of a food web, and you can see that at every link between successive trophic levels, we have energy lost as heat. So let's make sure we would be able to describe why the amount of available energy decreases as you move up the food chain or through a food web. And just remember that as energy is dispersed to the environment between these trophic levels, there's always going to be a reduction in the amount of energy passed from one trophic level to the next. So now we're going to talk about something that we call the laws of thermodynamics, and the movement of energy is governed by these laws and subject to them. So there's two of these laws that we're going to take a look at. The first one is sometimes called the law of conservation of energy. And what this says is that energy in a closed system is neither created nor destroyed. For example, in the universe, the amount of total energy is constant. And all that can happen is that the form the energy takes can change. So in other words, it can be transferred and transformed into other types of energy. For example, the things that we were just talking about, energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, but only about 10% is passed on. And of course, we know where does the rest of it go? It's lost as heat as you move from one trophic level to the next. So when the energy is lost as heat, where does it end up? It goes to the atmosphere, and this usually happens during cellular respiration. And if we think about this in terms of energy coming from the sun and hitting the earth, about 30% of that energy from the sun is actually reflected right back into space, and 50% of it is converted to heat as it hits the earth, and we end up with only about 1% of the incoming light from the sun being used during photosynthesis. So all these transfers and transformations, they result in a loss of energy from the actual ecosystem, but it's important to note that it does not disappear. It's lost as heat and it moves to other places, either the atmosphere or it's lost from Earth entirely or reflected back to other places. So think about if we could, at this point, be able to explain how the first law of thermodynamics impacts the ecosystem stability in terms of the transfer of energy when moving from one trophic level to the next. So this moves us into the second law of thermodynamics, which says that entropy, which is another way of saying disorder, or you could also say chaos, always increases over time. So entropy is actually a measurement of the amount of disorder within a system, and it refers to the fact that energy will spread out or disperse as the system progresses. Now, the energy will naturally go from a concentrated form into a dispersed form or a wasted form. So over time, as time progresses, all of the differences in energy concentration, for example, it's concentrated in an organism, the differences in energy in the universe will be evened out until nothing can change anymore. So in other words, we can't hang on to every bit of energy because it naturally dissipates, and we know that energy transfer is not 100% effective when we move between the trophic levels. For example, we talked about only 1% of solar energy is converted during photosynthesis, and then only about 10% of the energy that is consumed is assimilated and converted to biomass, and as a secondary consumer, it's the same number, it's 10% again. So if we take a look at this diagram down here in the right-hand corner, if we have 1,000 joules of light energy converted during photosynthesis by a producer, only 10 joules of that energy can be used by the primary consumer. So we have right off the bat a 990 joule reduction from this first movement between trophic levels. And then as the carnivore consumes the herbivore, only 1 joule of energy out of the 10 that the herbivore consumed can be used by that carnivore. So we have a 10% reduction between these trophic levels and a 99% reduction from solar energy to photosynthesis. So not only can we say that the transfer of energy is not 100% effective, I mean, it's not even close. And if we think about this in terms of the ecosystem as a whole kind of battling against entropy, the idea is that life is constantly against entropy. And the only way that life can be sustained over long periods of time is with a constant input of energy to replenish the energy that's lost throughout a food web or a food chain. For example, here we have the sun and we have the autotroph here. It's only with this constant replenishment that life can even exist in the first place. So at this point, hopefully we would be able to explain how the second law of thermodynamics impacts ecosystem stability. So next we're going to talk about equilibrium, which is a state of balance. And it's important to note that when we say something is in equilibrium, it doesn't mean that it's not changing. And if we think about this in terms of chemical equilibrium, we can have a chemical reaction that's taking place and the reaction doesn't stop. It's just that the reactants are turning into products at the same rate that the products are turning into the reactants. So we would say that this does not mean something's not changing, it just means that it's balanced and stable. So the rate of the forward reaction equals the rate of the reverse reaction. So there are a couple different types of equilibrium that we're going to discuss. The first one here is steady state equilibrium. So you can think of this as fluctuating equilibrium. And basically this is a characteristic of open systems where there are continuous inputs and outputs of energy and matter, but the system as a whole remains in a more or less constant state. So it's always changing based on these inputs and outputs, but the equilibrium as a whole remains in a stable, constant existence. An example here would be a climax community, which is basically something that you would see in mature forests, or we also call them old growth forests, where you'd have large trees. The organisms that live within this ecosystem have already adapted to being there, and you no longer have changes in this environment taking place. Now, in this example, the climax community will remain relatively unchanged until it's destroyed by some kind of catastrophic event, such as a forest fire, or we go in there and chop all the trees down for whatever reason. So our steady state equilibrium is different than the other type that we call static equilibrium, which remains constant over time, but the difference here is that there are no changes, no inputs and outputs taking place, and we don't see this occurring in living systems. And if we take a look at an example here, if you have a pile of books that are just sitting there, they're not going to move unless they're disturbed. And before they're disturbed, the forces within the system are in balance, and the components, which would be the books, are just going to sit there. They're not going to change. And unless they're messed with, they could sit there for long periods of time. And right, if we think about this, why could this not occur in living systems? Because as living things go about their life cycle, they have to have the exchange of energy and also matter, which occurs between the biotic and abiotic factors in an ecosystem. So hopefully we'd be able to distinguish between steady state and static equilibrium. So moving on, we're going to talk about now the concept of feedback within systems. So systems have feedback mechanisms that occur as the components within a system affect the other components. So this feedback can help maintain equilibrium within a system and cause that equilibrium to stabilize, or it could force a system out of equilibrium and cause it to become unstable. The first type of feedback here is negative feedback. So this is feedback that tends to stabilize systems and it helps to maintain the equilibrium of that system. An example here, if we have rabbits and wolves within an ecosystem, as the number of rabbits increases, so does the number of the wolves, and as the number of wolves increases, the number of rabbits would tend to decrease. So this is an example of negative feedback because it is a stabilizing force. So if the size of our prey populations increases, there's more food for the predators, so they eat more and they breed more, which results in more predators, which then eat more prey, so the prey numbers decrease. And then if you have fewer prey, there's less food for the predators, and the predators' population size would decrease. So again, this is a stabilizing force, so it's an example of negative feedback. So then we have positive feedback, which tends to destabilize systems and take them out of equilibrium. And they can permanently change the system to a totally new state if it passes a point that we call the tipping point. And if you want to read more or learn about the specifics of tipping points, you can check out page 38 and 39 in the textbook. So our example here of a positive feedback loop, we've got some cattle out in a field and one gets startled and starts to run. This causes another to run, which causes a few more to run, etc., until we have a flat-out stampede. So in our positive feedback loop here, we have the number of cattle running increasing, and this causes the level of overall panic to increase, which then increases the number of cattle running, etc. This is how positive feedback loops can cause what we call a vicious cycle. So positive feedback loops tend to amplify changes, while negative feedback loops tend to minimize changes. Let's take a look at another example here and see if we can decide if this example is positive or negative feedback. So when a mother is in labor, a hormone called oxytocin is released, and this hormone intensifies and speeds up contractions of the uterus. This increase in contractions actually causes more oxytocin to be released, and the process continues. So once again, would this be positive or negative feedback? So we'll wrap up the notes here with a discussion on ecosystem resilience. So this is how well a system responds to a disturbance, or you can think of it as how well the system maintains equilibrium. So the more resilient a system is, the more disturbance it can deal with, and how well a system can return to its initial state after a disturbance. And if a system has low resilience, it could enter a new state of equilibrium. In broad terms, the more diverse or complex an ecosystem is, the more resilient it tends to be, as we have more interactions between different species within that ecosystem. If we think about resilience in terms of individual species within an ecosystem, the more geographic range, the more range that a species can exist in, the more resilient that species tends to be, as it wouldn't be affected by, for example, something like climate change. In general, the more different pieces to a system there are, the more stable that system tends to be. For example, we can talk in terms of biodiversity or genetic diversity. The greater diversity that we have, the more stability we will have. And there are other factors other than diversity that can impact ecosystem resilience. See if you could think of a couple, and we should be able to discuss those if we needed to. So this is the end of the notes. Don't forget to write your 3 questions and your summary.